Hi, this is Ken 1171, and this time I want to bring you a brand new script that might revolutionize the way we render in Poser. This is the very first script that brings full 32-bit HDRI lighting into Poser that fully automates the whole process with one click. That was never done before, and not because that's something just I can do, but because the feature that allowed me to do this in Poser Python was only introduced in Poser 13. So this is actually the very first time because it was not possible to do this before. So here I have a scene with three objects: glass of wine that doesn't look much of a glass of wine because it's using native cycles shaders, so it doesn't show in previews, and then a golden ball and a helmet with procedural materials. And if we switch to the other camera, you can see here that this is a typical Poser scene where we have a Poser ground. Let me hide it for now. And you can see that there is absolutely nothing else in the scene. Let me bring the ground back and switch back to the main camera. So typically in a Poser scene, you have your characters or objects in the scene, but there is absolutely nothing around them. And what happens here, if I render this, you will notice that it may look okay, this is what we are used to, but if I remove the ground and try this again, take a look what happens. The glass turns pitch black, the bottom of a sphere turns pitch black. We can see that we have three lights here. If I show you here the lights, I have a typical 3-point light setup with key, rim, and fill. And those are these three here. And you can see the highlights in the gold ball, but there's nothing else to reflect. And whenever you have nothing else to reflect, the material turns black, and that's what happens with the glass here. Let me bring the ground back and render again. And let's compare the two. Without the ground and with the ground, you might notice that the only thing that improves here is that the glass and the ball and the helmet now have the ground to reflect and bounce light to contribute to the lighting, but nothing else is going on here. And this is why this render, although it may look good, it's not realistic. And this is where HDRI comes in. What is HDRI? Well, it means high dynamic range image, and it's a digital image format that captures the full range of light and darkness details in a scene. When it's used in 3D rendering, it provides more accurate representation of indoor or outdoor environments in a 360 degrees encompassing. Enables you to create more realistic renders because it's a full encompassing environment that goes all around the scene. So no matter from what side you look at the objects, there is always something to reflect. You may look around the room you're sitting on right now. If you look around, there are walls, there's ceiling, there's a floor, possibly furniture and bookshelves, and all this is contributing to the reflections you get. For example, if you have a window, this window will be reflecting all of that. So that doesn't happen in Poser because, as we saw before, there is nothing in the scene by default. Now, let me show you the script. It's called HDRI control. Here it is. And at the very top here, this is where you find your HDRI maps. You can download these images from the internet. In the manual, I provide a link to a popular site called HDRI Heaven. And if you go there, you can download a large amount of HDRI images. Let me show you some of them here. By default, if you click these three dots here, it opens the browsing dialog, and this is where Poser 13 places some of the bundled HDRI images on runtime, textures, HDR, VFX. And if you select that folder, actually, I think the script will select it by default. This is the collection of images you get. In my humble opinion, they're not very good. but it's good to have them. When I say they're not very good, I mean they are not very high dynamic range, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of having them, meaning they are not shot with many exposures, which tends to produce low quality renders. So I want to take this opportunity to show one of the features in this script, which is this down arrow here. And if you click it, it opens a list of all the places you have previously browsed to. So no matter how many folders that you browsed to before, it adds them here so that you don't have to browse if you wanted to return to them. For example, I can go back to this or jump back to the other folder where my images are. And whenever you browse to a new location, it gets added to this list. So it makes it quick for you to jump from between folders without having to browse. Alright, this is where I store my custom HDRI maps. And I want to start with this Gardens Volume 2, which was kindly supplied by Mac4D. And it's, if I expand here, you'll see that this is a 10K HDRI map. It's very high resolution. So if I just select it, nothing appeared to have happened. But actually, I already set up my entire HDRI for the scene. Want to see it? All I have to do is click the render button, which is this one over here, and let it render. It's loading the map now, and voila, this is what it looks like. Let's compare to what we had before and what we have now. And you may notice, hey Ken, it looks like everything is overlit. It's too much light. What's going on here? Well, what happened here is that in addition to the HDRI that was set up and added to the scene, you're still rendering all the three lights you had before. The way we render HDRI should be like we have to go one by one through these lights and disable all of them, then render. And after you render, you have to enable them back, or else you end up with a pitch black preview. Well, I added a feature here called Disable Scene Lights, which is this checkbox here. If I just click it, and boom, all your problems are solved. And you may be asking, hey Ken, you said it disables the light, but I can still see the lights here. So how come it says it has disabled them? Okay, here's the trick. It disables them on renders, but it still lights your previews, meaning that you will never be left with pitch black previews as if you were using HDRI manually before. That's what you probably have been going through. So let's render again and see the difference. Now with scene lights disabled. Okay, now the scene lights are disabled. Let's compare with what we had before. As you can see, it's not as bright as before, but I don't see the environment. Where is the environment? Well, here's the thing. The ground is blocking it. So I added another feature here called Setup Shadow Catcher. What I want to do here is I want to get rid of the ground, but I still want to be able to project shadows on it. And if you click this option here, it may look like nothing has happened, but let's render and see what we have now. Yeah, as you can see, now the HDRI environment is showing up. You can see the reflections and refractions, even caustics happening here in the glass and the fluid. And all we had to do was turn the ground into a shadow catcher. And that's as simple as checking this box here. But still, you may notice here the background doesn't seem to be in the same perspective and scale as your objects. What's going on here? Okay, what happens here is that HDRI images are usually shot with a camera focal length of 35, and here the default is 75, which is more or less the equivalent of human vision, which ranges from around 55 to 75. But HDRI images, because they have to encompass 360 degrees environment, they are shot at wide-angle lenses, which is 35 millimeters. So I have an option here to make this easier for you. If you check this Set Camera Focal box here, look what happens. The camera changes to 35 millimeter focal length. So if we look here, if I toggle this checkbox, it changes the camera perspective. So I have to frame my objects again, like this. And if I render now, you will notice that now the background and my objects are exactly in the same perspective because I'm matching the camera lenses with the one that was used to shoot this HDRI image. Take a look at the ground here. I have very sharp shadows, and the glass is reflecting everything around it. So this is very realistic. If you look before and after, this is before matching the camera, and this is after. So now if I move back a little and render again, you'll see I have a pretty good integration with my 3D objects and the scene they're in. And I can even rotate around and keep rendering. You'll see that no matter from what side I'm looking at the objects, I still have a perfect integration of my 3D objects with the environment. Isn't that cool? Alright, let's take a look at color saturation option here. It's a simple slider. Default is 100% saturation. And if you go to 200%, let me show you what happens. Let me frame my scene again and render. With color saturation set to 200%, this is going to make the HDRI image very saturated in colors, which causes the reflections and general image to be very colorful. You can use this anyway between 100% to 200% or all the way to 0. And if you render again, you have the opposite effect, where the HDRI now has no color, which means all reflections, refractions, and color contributions are grayscale, which can give some nice artistic compositions depending on what you want to do. If you hover the mouse over any of the controls, you get a description of what they do and also some extra options. For example, this one has a second line on the caption that says if I right-click the slider, I reset it back to default. And this is valid for all sliders here. So let's go to the HDRI rotation. If you look at the last render, I'm looking at the HDRI image as it was shot. The camera was facing this direction by default. And with this slider here, the Y rotation is the vertical axis rotation, which means rotating the camera to the sides. The rotations happens in degree. For example, if I move it all the way to the right, I have a 180 degrees rotation to the right, meaning the HDRI image will be rotated. The entire environment will be rotated 180 degrees, which means half a turn to the right. And this is what it looks like. The camera is basically now facing the environment to the opposite direction as it was in the beginning, if you compare them now. And if I move it to the opposite side, for example, 90 degrees to the left, it just means I'm rotating the entire environment 85 degrees to the left. And this is what it looks like now. So you can either keep this at 0, I just right-clicked it here, or rotate the camera, because then your objects will rotate too. If you want to keep your objects framed as they are, just rotate the environment. This is how you do it. The x-axis moves the horizon up and down, and the z-axis rotates the horizon to the right or to the left. And this is the equivalent of Dutch tilt. It can be used for composition depending on what you want, but then you could do that with the camera as well. This is what it would do. Alright, so this covers more or less all the settings you can use. Depending on what HDRI map, you may have to adjust the gamma value. Usually it's 2.2, but in some cases, depending on who made it, they may have set it to 1.0. And the white balance is when you want to add a tint to the image. For example, if I add a green, a bright green here, it will turn the render. Let me get to my camera here and reset it. If I add a green tint and render, the whole image, the environment will have a green tint like this. It's like you put a kind of a gel in front of the camera to add a color. And if you reset it back to white, it goes back to default. The thing is, the reason it's called white balance is that some HDRI images may come with a tint and you can counter it. For example, if the image has a lot of yellows and oranges that overwhelm the environment color, you can counter it by adding blue to it, like this. By adding blue, you can counter oranges and such and so on. So that's why it's called white balance. You can either use it to counterbalance, to remove tints from the image, or on the contrary, to add a tint to the image, which can be used for artistic purposes. Once you are done, let's say you want to go back to how it was before, you want to remove HDRI, this is the button you press. If you click here, it removes everything and goes back to how it was before. Before I do that, I want to show you this last option here, load HDRI when selected. That has to do with this button here. This option is enabled by default, meaning that whenever I pick a map from the list, like the Ruins B, it automatically presses this button so you don't have to. So if you disable this and load another map, nothing will happen until you press the button. That's basically what it is. So let me go back to Ruins B. This is a curious map. I love playing with this because if you are in DAZ Studio, this is the default HDRI you have in DAZ Studio 4. So if I just render as it is with this map, it may look familiar to you because this is exactly the kind of look you get in DAZ Studio if you use the default lighting, but there is a difference. In DAZ Studio, if you have no lights in your scene, remember, first option here disables all scene lights. In DAZ Studio, you cannot have that. What happens is whenever you have no lights on the scene, DAZ Studio automatically adds a headlamp, as it calls, and attaches it to the camera. So let me get this light here and bring it more or less to the front. I want you to see this option here, disable only the current light. If I uncheck this, I now have enabled this scene to affect the render. And I want you to look what happens when I render now, and we're gonna compare with the previous render. Now take a look here, before enabling this light, and then after. As you can see, I'm kind of simulating the headlamp from DAZ Studio, except that here I can put it whatever I want, while in DAZ Studio it will always be head center attached to the camera. Whatever the camera is looking at, that light is going to be pointing the same direction. And in addition to that, because this HDRI map was calibrated to work with the headlamp, it is also very dark. So to compensate, I'm going to set exposure to 2 and render again. I want you to take a look. Now we have that DAZ Studio render look from iRay. I believe the exposure is set to 2 by default in DAZ Studio. So by setting it to 2 here, I'm matching more or less what the iRay renders will look like in DAZ Studio. I find that amusing because I'm just rendering with the default lighting from DAZ Studio in Poser. And that's kind of amusing. All right, so one last thing. You can, of course, revert your scene to how it was before by pressing the Remove HDRI. When I press this, it also removes the camera focal, so it goes back to how it was before. And you also have to enable your scene lights. Again, let me show you what happens if you don't. If I render without any lights, guess what happens? You have pitch black image. So if you enable them back and render, there you go. You have your regular Poser scene as it was before you did anything to it. So I just wanted to show how this script automates everything, adding and including removal of HDRI controls with just one click. As usual with my scripts, you have the question mark, which if you click, you can open the PDF manual where I have covered everything, even things I may not have explained here in this video. So feel free to check the manual for anything else you may want to see. All right, then that's what I wanted to show you. Thank you.